This morning we studied about the need for us to overcome the temptation of instant gratification as it's presented to us throughout from day to day. And as we mentioned this morning, there were four aspects in which we can help ourselves to overcome and prepare for those moments when temptation is seeking us out. Sometimes it'll just present itself, and we have to be ready to think through those temptations and be able to choose that which is right. I also mentioned that there was going to be a second part to this, and I tried very hard to figure out a way to put it all in one, but it just wasn't going to work. So, given how it went down, I'm glad I did it that way. So this afternoon, I'd like to consider 7 reasons why instant gratification, or the desire for instant gratification, is part of human nature. Reasons why we have a hard time as human beings in general with stopping and thinking through when those moments arise where we desperately want to yield to that in the moment, to that pleasure or whatever it is that presents itself that we know we shouldn't do. And as I mentioned this morning, and I had on one of the slides 4 sources. And most of those sources, all of those sources, had to deal mainly with the concept of instant gratification in just general, in life, with regard to losing weight, in business, in job satisfaction, and so forth. But in looking at that, the applications that they mentioned, I figured, hey, some of these we can adapt and understand how it helps us in our spiritual life as well. And so these 7 aspects of instant gratification that lend themselves to kind of pulling at that natural instinct that we have are what we want to cover this afternoon. As we mentioned this morning in our definition of instant gratification and deferred gratification, that the idea of that immediate pleasure that is often presented to us, it's kind of just part of human nature. It's human urge to want good things and to want them now, not later. And of course, the flip side of instant gratification is delayed gratification. The decision to put off for now something, my desire, whatever, and in this case, in our context, the idea of putting off, staving away temptation and yielding to sin in order to gain an even better reward or benefit in the future. And at the heart of instant gratification is one of the most basic drives that we have. When it comes to us as human beings, there tends to be an instinctual desire for pleasure while avoiding pain. And so oftentimes this basic instant gratification desire, temptation, it lends itself to here's immediate pleasure and avoiding perhaps pain in the moment, even though, especially as it pertains to our souls, we know that there is a price to pay for that choice. But that's not what we think about. You would think that it should be easy in those moments of temptation to think about Jesus on the cross. And we should think about Jesus on the cross. But every part of us that is being appealed to on the basis of this temptation, the human part of us isn't going to want to think about Jesus on the cross. Or we're going to try to justify it somehow. Well, you know what, I'll go ahead and do this now, and I'll just pray for forgiveness later. And we've talked about that quite a bit in the past. So as I mentioned, the question is, why is it so difficult? What parts of our psyche, what parts of our nature as human beings would cause us to choose now, knowing the consequences, rather than withstanding temptation for a home in heaven later? And so for the next couple of minutes, I want to consider these 7 aspects and consider, and we're not going to go to these particular passages, but consider examples from the Old and New Testaments of individuals who kind of fit within that pattern. And some of these may apply to multiple of these examples as well. One aspect of reason why it's so hard as human beings for us to resist instant gratification is a desire to avoid delay. It's often uncomfortable for us to resist something that I know I'm going to enjoy. All right? Now, obviously, in just a general application, this can apply to the great desserts we had last night, for instance. Okay, the knowing, I know I'm going to pay for this later, but you know what? That is so good. It looks so good. That urge that you have to, I'll just get a little bit, then you get up there and, I'll end up with a whole slice. That's the type of stuff that most of these articles kind of applied. But when you consider regarding the soul, understanding that even in matters of sin, our human aspect, that physical part of our mind and our heart, it's still uncomfortable for us to deny what we know may cause us momentary pleasure, momentary desire. And all our instincts want to seize that opportunity. And when I was thinking about this particular aspect, I thought about David. David as an example in particular in the throes of his temptation as he's seeing Bathsheba. And then to allow that thought process to cause him to inquire about her. And then despite knowing that she's married, then pursue her, call her to him. All of that, it's a very human part. We understand that. And yet you ask yourself, well, why? Well, he saw her on the roof and he wanted her. And it's that refusal to avoid desire. It's that delay. He refused to give up on that thought process. And of course, as a result, not only did he sin with Bathsheba, not only did she become pregnant as a result, but that also led to his attempting to cover it up, ultimately leading to the death of Uriah the Hittite, as well as any others that were in the midst of that withdrawal, that retreat where Uriah died. A second aspect that can certainly be a part of making it difficult for us to withstand or to fight against temptation of instant gratification sometimes has to do with age. A lot of times, and we know as younger people, and those of us who are younger, we understand that this certainly can be true. That we tend to be more impulsive, while generally speaking, older people, because of their experience in their lives and because of the things that they've been through, they are usually better able to resist that instant gratification. Now, that's not always true, and it certainly isn't true with every temptation. But with age, hopefully, and properly should, come patience. And come an understanding that, this may look good in the moment. This may seem like the thing to do right now, but it is going to cause you problems later. And especially as it pertains to sin. And, of course, I haven't gotten to that point, and, I'm just going to go with the thought process my kids are going to skip their teenage years. Okay, I'm going to go with that. But anybody who has attempted to raise a teenager understands that fight that you have, that constant wisdom that you have, attempting to help your teenager to understand that, it sounds good now, but trust me, it's not worth it. And of course, especially as it applies to sin, we know that to be the case. And there are examples of this that we could look at where age certainly played a part in bad decisions in the Old and New Testaments. But I got to thinking about the opposite of that. The fact that age is not necessarily, it's not an excuse. While we might be more susceptible because of our age, that doesn't cause us to be able to get a pass for making bad decisions in the moment. And you think about these young men like Daniel, in Daniel chapter 1, where Daniel, because of his, he was fair-looking and he had wisdom and so forth, and he was taken along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by Nebuchadnezzar. He was trained, and yet he was offered all of these pleasures that he knew were contrary to what the law of God told him to do. He could have yielded. He could have given in to peer pressure. There may have been Hebrews who were yielding themselves. And yet he chose to stand firm on what God expected of him. And you think about Joseph. We talked a little bit about Joseph this morning. There's nothing in the context of the account of Joseph with Potiphar's wife that suggested that he was tempted by her. But being a young man, given the state of mind that our human bodies sometimes put us into with hormones, he could have easily yielded. He could have stopped to think, well, God, she's trying to force this on me, so yeah, I'll just, I'll give in. But he didn't do that. Instead, he ran. And it's that wisdom that comes from knowing I have to serve God. And it doesn't matter how young or old I may be. I have to serve God and do whatever I have to do to avoid sin. Thirdly, sometimes when we're in the midst of being tempted, especially as it pertains to that immediate gratification opportunity, what lacks in us is the ability to see past it, to understand what's waiting for us by overcoming it and resisting that temptation. Imagination of looking forward to that home in heaven. Even John, in the glimpse that he was given of heaven, you had to use human terms to describe for us what must have been a majestic sight. And even those human terms, I'm sure, don't do it justice. And yet what he described in Revelation 4 with the throne of God, and later on when he's describing this New Jerusalem and its the gates of pearl and the street of gold, how magnificent that must have looked. And yet even that doesn't do it justice. But being able to envision what it is I'm looking forward to, what my goal is essential in order to overcome that, whatever it is that's in front of me right now, right then. The draw that it has in my heart or in my mind, whatever it is that's appealing to me, I have to be able to look beyond it and picture what heaven's going to be like. And I don't have Jesus on here, but Jesus would be the very first example. The thought process that Jesus was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. And at no point do we find a single example of Jesus using somehow miraculous power to prevent himself from being tempted. In fact, we find the opposite. We find Jesus being tempted not only as a man, but also as a son of God. In Matthew chapter 4. So imagine then, because the only thing Jesus had, if you want to call it an advantage, the only advantage he had was he remembered the glory that he had before. And we see that in the Gospel of John chapter 17, when he's offering this prayer to the Father on behalf of his disciples, and he's considering that glory that he once had, that his Father has promised he'll have again. Jesus knew what heaven was like. He understood that I'm heading back there. Which meant that his motivation and what must have been in the forefront of his mind every day for his 33-odd years of life must have been, I want to get back to heaven. Which gives us an implication as to how much greater heaven must be than all of this. If Jesus was able to forego instant gratification himself. Jesus was a teenager once. It's hard to think in those terms because for the most part, we really only see Jesus in his 30s when he's preaching and teaching in the Gospels. We don't really have a record of what Jesus did and what he was like when he was a teenager. And yet, he was sinless. Jesus didn't utilize the excuse of hormones or youth to justify yielding to instant gratification. Think about Moses. We read in Hebrews this morning about how Moses was willing to yield what would have been his birthright, or at least adopted birthright, of the pleasures of Egypt, being the grandson of Pharaoh. He was willing to give that up because he was looking to the reward of heaven. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and in verses 16 through 18, Paul, especially as is in this context of persecution, he says, we don't look at the things that are seen, but at the things that are not seen. For the things that are seen are temporary, but the things that are not seen are eternal. Utilizing not physical eyes and physical sight, but what we sometimes refer to as the eye of faith. Looking to that existence, no, we can't see it right now. But that conviction that it does exist and that the promise of God will be fulfilled, Paul says this is why we're willing to suffer. This is why we're willing to go through what we go through. Because we're not looking at this now, we're looking ahead. And so every opportunity of instant gratification that may have presented itself, Paul says we have to look beyond that to that which is eternal. Fourthly, and certainly many of us can appreciate and relate in some ways to this one. Another aspect that makes it difficult for us to overcome the temptation of instant gratification is impulsiveness. And that's not necessarily just something that is only for the young. That sometimes is part of personality. Some of us are just more impulsive, more spontaneous than others. More kind of having a whim and then going and doing that, and maybe it takes you away from your schedule. Those of us who procrastinate, you know who you are. Those of us who maybe daydream at work, is kind of just lack off a little bit. Those of us who, for whatever reason, decide the day before, hey, we're going to drive down to Houston and just go look at stuff. Okay, people are sometimes impulsive. And that's not bad. I mean, it's not a bad thing, unless you let it be. But it is a bad thing as a Christian if we allow that to cause us to sin. And of course, anytime you talk about an impulsive nature, you can't help but to think first about Peter. And I suggest to you that it wasn't just the fact that Peter was a relatively young man. Because the other disciples and other apostles were young too. But rather, I tend to think Peter, his nature was one that he tended to jump first, look second. And yet, as Peter goes throughout his life, especially as we get into 1st and 2nd Peter, the type of individual we read is still Peter, as described in the Gospels. But this is a Peter who has tempered his personality with wisdom. I suggest that he probably still had some aspects to him that were still impulsive. And that was probably something he had to fight, especially spiritually. But given the growth that took place, yes, with experience, but most especially with the guidance of the Word of God, knowing what it was expected of him, we see the change between what he was, especially when he went out and wept bitterly after denying the Lord, to then what we see starting in Acts 1, going all the way through into 2 Peter. We see wisdom, we see restraint, we see discipline. And that is absolutely something we can learn to control. Being impulsive can have its advantages in life. It can also put us in huge disadvantage as well. Even in our impulsive natures, we have to be able to think through what it is we're choosing to do. Even if we're convinced, I think this is the right thing to do, okay, think through it. Make sure. Because especially as Christians, as our souls are dependent upon our decisions, we have to make sure we look first, consider consequences, consider what my situation may be as a result of this action, and then proceed. Another aspect that makes instant gratification difficult for us is that often it can serve the need to regulate our emotions or to stabilize our mood. And in a lot of ways, and I think probably in many ways that maybe we're not always conscious of, this is something I think that we do fall to in life throughout the day even, or from day to day or week to week. Because emotional distress, times of sadness, times of depression, times where we're discouraged maybe, can change the way we approach a situation, can change our decision-making process. And when there is some opportunity for instant gratification, we may be more susceptible to leaping and grabbing it without thinking, because I know it'll make me feel better. Whereas right now I don't feel very good. And remember how before we talked about instant gratification having this pleasure now and avoiding pain. Well, sometimes people, they lunge at that opportunity for instant gratification to feel pleasure, but sometimes it's just I'm in pain and I don't want to be this way anymore. I don't want to feel like this anymore. I'm sad, I'm depressed, whatever it may be. And so grabbing hold of that instant gratification helps us to escape that. There are times we're human. We all have bad days. Sometimes we wake up, they say we wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Sometimes you wake up and you don't have time for coffee. And you're just not in a good mood. And that happens. That happens. But first of all, bad moods, boredom, and impatience, regardless of its source and cause, is no excuse to sin or to not be the example we should. That's first. But especially as it applies to instant gratification, we cannot allow those moments where we're just emotionally worn out, or we're bored, or for whatever reason we've been fighting traffic all day. Around here that's not really much of a problem, but we're fighting traffic, somebody cut us off, somebody made us mad, and we allow that to make us more susceptible to yielding to the opportunity to help me forget it for a little bit. And a lot of times people in our world certainly utilize instant gratification, often sinfully, in a way to not just feel good, but to avoid feeling bad. When I was thinking long and hard about, is there an example in the New Testament of somebody in a bad mood? Or somebody who allowed a bad situation or someone who was sad to cause how they changed what they did? And I thought about Lot. You remember Lot, how that his wife was turned into a pillar of salt because she disobeyed the command to not look back. So he and his daughters end up in the mountains. And it's not just the sin he committed with his daughters that ultimately ended up spawning nations that were thorns in the side of Israel, but also just the fact that he allowed them to put him in the situation where he was drunk on consecutive days. This wasn't just a single moment of bad decision. Consecutive days, they got him drunk, so drunk that he didn't even know what he'd done by the time it was over. And I suggest to you that Lot, remember we're told about Lot that hearing these terrible deeds and sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah caused him great pain. Lot, generally speaking, is not considered a sinful person. He's considered an individual who, because of the place in which he lived, this caused him terrible turmoil. He tried to be a good example, but once again, letting appearances, he jumped first without really thinking it through. He ended up making the choice to settle there in the first place. But because of the situation that ended up existing, It makes me wonder if he didn't allow his daughters to get him that drunk consecutively because of all the stuff that had happened. His wife was now a pillar of salt. The cities where he lived have been destroyed. That could put a person in a position not just to want to feel good or feel better, but to not feel bad anymore, to not have to think about it anymore. And that's why sometimes people turn to abusive substances, because it's not just about feeling good or better, it's about not wanting to feel bad. And it makes me wonder if that didn't motivate him some. And certainly Ahab. The example we have of Ahab who wanted Naboth's vineyard. And because he wouldn't sell it to him, Ahab was basically throwing a temper tantrum, wouldn't eat, he was on his bed, his countenance had fallen. Jezebel, she comes in, why are you so upset? Oh, that mean old dude won't sell me his vineyard. So what did Jezebel do? She arranged for him to be killed so that Ahab could have the vineyard. There are examples in the New Testament and Old Testament where we can infer that certainly events that transpired may have had an impact on the decision-making that people had. And certainly the prospect of instant gratification when we're in the midst of a bad day can be particularly enticing. But we have to be able to think through it, because guess what? We can have a bad day physically. We can have a stressful day. We can have any kind of day. Job had an awful day. But that doesn't change our responsibility for being faithful Christians. And it doesn't give us the right to say, well, God didn't prevent me from having this awful day, so you know what, I think I deserve to be able to sin a little bit. That's not how that works. And unfortunately, Lot, and also with the example of Ahab and Jezebel, of course, they had many more problems than just bad moods. But certainly those are two examples where we find that does not coincide with faithful service to God. Second to last of these points that I want to bring out about why it's often so difficult for us to avoid sin when it's presented as instant gratification is the addictive quality that it can sometimes present. We know that when we feel rewarded, when there's something that we gain that makes us feel better, our brains produce a chemical called dopamine. And it's, in essence, a feel-good hormone, feel-good chemical. It makes us feel better. It's possible to be addicted to working out, for instance, because those who work out can allow that to become such a rush that's all they think about. That's all they want to do is go to the gym, work out, or go run. And certainly, taking care of our bodies is important. But the danger of allowing those rushes of feeling better, that we call it runner's high sometimes, that can be obtained by a lot of different means. And if we're not careful, when you combine the idea of things that release that chemical within my brain and that I can keep coming back to and keep feeling that momentary high, you combine that with, for all intents in our societies, the opportunity for us to basically have anything we want at our fingertips. Anything that might make us feel better, we can go to the store or we can look it up on the internet or whatever it is to make us feel better. And as a result, instant gratification lends itself to causing more addictive habits. And of course, one of the primary problems is that when it comes to addictive habits, it is dependent upon us not thinking through the choice and the decision. Instead, when we get into the habit that is addictive, we almost do it by nature after a while. It's not something you wrestle with. It's not something you really feel shame for anymore. Your conscience becomes seared, and you just do it as a natural part of your thought process. We have to be careful of the addictive nature that instant gratification can provide. Because if we're not careful and we get into that role of simply habitually thinking that way or committing that sin, all of a sudden we're going to feel as if we're dependent on it. And we have to receive our ultimate feeling better, if you will, not from the flesh, but from God. Think about Solomon. And even though this isn't necessarily written out in Scripture, there's certainly evidence to suggest that Solomon, given his penchant for all these foreign wives, that there was something about Solomon that lended itself to a desire. A desire, whether it was for the sexual nature that presented, or for just being able to, I don't like to put it this way, but collecting all of these wives. All the beautiful women he could find. And he had a ton of both wives and concubines. And that led his heart astray. But I don't think it happened overnight. When we consider the fact that this must have been something that kind of gradually happened, where he just got to the point where he wasn't thinking about God anymore. And he wasn't thinking about these false idols being sinful. Well, what was the root of it? What was the cause of it? Well, obviously the Scriptures imply that it had to do with his wives. Well, why continue to accumulate these wives? Maybe it had something to do with instant gratification. An inability an unwillingness for him to step aside from what his desire may be as king and instead choose what is best for his soul. And in many ways, we see him acknowledge that in Ecclesiastes. In many ways, we see him acknowledge the danger of getting caught up in, even though he doesn't use this phrase, instant gratification. That's why he emphasizes wisdom so much. Think about Simon the sorcerer. Simon the sorcerer, part of his problem that he had to do not just with the idea that he could purchase the gift of God. It had to deal with his motivation for wanting to. It wasn't just that he was just honestly mistaken and he just didn't understand that you can't purchase this. Remember, Peter says you're caught in the gall of bitterness, he said. What if Simon, his quality of addiction, if you will, this instant gratification he obtained was in being in the limelight, of having the attention he certainly did before Philip came to Samaria, and ultimately before Peter came. He was the center of attention. And you know, those who are like individuals who go up on stage, comedians and so forth, there is a high that they receive. There is a rush they receive in being in the spotlight. Well, what if maybe that was part of Simon's problem? And whether he was conscious of it or not, his desire to purchase the gift of God, it wasn't to help the spread of the gospel, but rather there was a part of him that knew, if I do this, if I'm able to obtain this ability, that'll put me right back in the spotlight. The addictive quality of instant gratification cannot be understated, and we have to be careful. And then finally, the final aspect that we must be aware of, the danger that instant gratification provides. And this is something that I was thinking about in terms of, because when you boil it down, sometimes you just get tired. Sometimes, whether it's physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, sometimes you get worn out. And sometimes when that instant gratification appears, it's just easier. It's just something that maybe it appeals to some laziness within me. I'm too tired. Some advantage that's being taken by this temptation because of the weariness within me. Because throughout this, I was thinking about Job. And certainly Job, you could fit Job into some of these examples, good examples, of some of these situations that we've talked about already. But I got to thinking about the instinct to yield to that which is easy, especially to those who are weary. And my first thought process was not necessarily Job, but Job's wife. There in the midst of all that had happened, and not to in any way try to diminish what must have been an emotional turmoil, physical turmoil, instead of praising God, she blamed him. And she attempted to get Job to curse God and die, because if God really, if you claim you haven't done anything wrong, then your God's not worthy to be worshipped. Why continue to serve him? If you didn't deserve this, then obviously God is unjust. And yet Job maintained not only his righteousness, that I haven't done anything wrong, but also maintained, shall we accept good from God, but not adversity? He says, you speak as the foolish women speak. And it makes me think that no matter how unbelievably, emotionally, mentally, and eventually physically exhausted Job must have been, he did not allow his spirit to become weary in the sense of yielding to instant gratification. There could have been that opportunity to just curse God and die. Just be done with it all. I'm tired. He could have done that. And that's not to say he didn't get weary spiritually. When we read on, especially in his conversation with the Lord, you can tell he's weary. But he didn't give up. And he didn't allow the opportunities for instant gratification or what'll make you feel better, just curse God and die. He didn't allow that to sway him. Now, any one of these 7 aspects of the danger of instant gratification can be used against us at any point during the day. Whether we think ourselves immune to impulsiveness, we think we're of an age perhaps that won't apply to us, Satan is going to use whatever means he can to reach us. And he is going to use the temptation of instant gratification on us constantly. Constantly. Because the human part of us tends to be susceptible to it. And we mentioned this morning in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul goes through the armor that we as Christians are to have equipped. And he describes standing against the wiles of the devil and having done all, he says, to stand. Having done all. Having gone through every trial. Having been tested in every way. Having been put through the gauntlet. Having done all. What will have gotten us through it? The armor of God. In Ephesians chapter 4, and in verses 26 and 27, Paul described not letting the sun go down on your wrath, not give place to anger. And then he says in verse 27, do not give place to the devil. And yet, by allowing just the thought of instant gratification, just that battle, if we allow it to get to that point where it's something that I'm thinking about, and we can still say no, but I guarantee you that it's going to be far more difficult once we've allowed just that little sliver of thought into our mind for us at that moment to turn away than if we had done so in the moment immediately. David should have turned around, gone back to bed, but even up until he allowed his thoughts to go to lust, he could have still turned around. He could have still said no. But when we're in that moment, we don't want to think like that. We want to think about what's going to make us feel good now. Do not give place to the devil. Don't let him get a foothold. Don't let him get a toehold. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 5 and in verse 8 that the devil is like a roaring lion, roaming around seeking whom he may devour. He is going to use every wile, he's going to use every dart in his quiver to break us. And instant gratification is one of those aspects of temptation that sometimes may fly under the radar. May not be necessarily something we really think about a lot. But this is why, and I hope our lesson this morning and this afternoon helps us to think more and pay more attention to the danger of instant gratification. As we noted this morning, there are many ways for us to be able to overcome, 4 of which is to be determined to serve God no matter what, to know my strengths and weaknesses, to be aware of that, and to be aware of my surroundings, and to always, in the forefront of my mind, have what it is I'm after. I'm not after this, I'm after heaven. So if I'm looking at the things that are eternal, not the things that are temporary, then I have no business dabbling in pleasure that is only temporary, rather than looking forward to the glory and the pleasure that awaits us in heaven that is eternal. That's the lesson for you this afternoon. As I mentioned, I hope that this is something that helps us to think a little bit deeper into the nature of temptation. Instant gratification isn't the only dart that Satan has at his disposal. But it certainly is one that appeals to our human nature. And it's one that we can, without even thinking about it, can fall to, and before we realize it, it's already done. We have to be aware of ourselves. We have to be aware of what Satan's willing to do to try to get us to fall away. Let's make sure that we are proactive, because if you're only reacting to what the devil tries to do, then it's not going to be enough. That's the lesson. We offer an invitation to anyone who needs their soul to be right in the sight of God, anyone who needs help to be baptized, anyone who needs to ask forgiveness for sins, who needs encouragement. Every one of us has been guilty of sin. Every one of us has been guilty of instant gratification to sin. We all need the help of each other to get to heaven. We can't do it by ourselves. And if you need help this afternoon, come forward as we stand and sing.